Hey everyone, welcome back. My name is Andrea, and I'm excited to be walking you through this data migration demo for Power Apps. The use case is I have a SQL database with related tables, and the primary and foreign keys are all integers. The challenge is that Dataverse only accepts GUIDs for primary and foreign keys. This process has multiple steps and layers, but I assure you we will arrive at a successful data migration using Azure Data Factory to copy data. I hope this is helpful. Please comment below with any questions and feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn and Twitter to say hello. Let's get started on high-level steps. So these are the high-level steps. I'm going to be walking you through the Azure SQL database instance in Azure portal. Make sure that you have that set up before we get started. Next, we will ensure that we have all of the tables and columns added in Power Apps in our solution. We want to make sure that the tables and columns match the tables and columns inside of our SQL database. And third, we want to set up our Azure Data Factory to be able to copy over that data. Before we get to that, we want to ensure that everything is set up correctly in Power Apps and Azure SQL. So the first thing we want to do is we want to ensure that our Azure portal is set up correctly. We want to ensure that we have an Azure SQL database set up, a SQL server, a resource group to that SQL server, and an Azure subscription. In this scenario, I am pretending that I am using an old SQL server where the primary keys are integers and they will not be able to transfer well into the Dataverse where the unique identifier is a GUID. I have created two tables for this scenario, one table for student, one table for lesson. The lesson table has a relationship to the student table. And as you can see here, I've added a column called lesson ID where it references the lesson ID inside of the lesson table. So once we get into Power Apps, I'm going to demo how I'm going to create this relationship between integers when Dataverse asks for a GUID when creating the relationship using a lookup. Inside of Power Apps, I have created a solution for this demo, and I've created the same two tables that I just showed you in the SQL database. I've created these inside of Power Apps. Inside of the student table, I've created custom fields that match the same columns as the SQL database for student. I have the primary text field as first name, I have email, age, city, last name, and I've created a lookup to the lesson table. Same idea for the lesson table. I have created all of the same columns as you saw in the SQL database. We have lesson name, start date, end date, lesson type, and no lookups here. There's a little bit of pre-work before we actually go into Azure Data Factory and start copying over the data from the SQL database to Dataverse. Since the IDs in both of these tables are integers and the IDs in Power Apps are unique identifiers, meaning they are GUIDs, they will not be able to transfer over correctly once we are in Azure Data Factory. We're going to have to map an integer column in both of these tables to that GUID that is the unique identifier. So what we're going to have to do is create an integer column inside of each of these tables. I'm going to call this column something very simple so we can find it. It's going to be called lesson number ID, and we're going to switch that data type to whole number. An important step that we have to do is we have to create a key for each of these tables. So we're going to go to the keys column, we're going to add a key, and we're going to name this something that we can remember. I've named mine lesson number ID key because we're going to relate it to that lesson number column that we just created since it's an integer or a whole number. And then we'll go ahead and save the table. We'll do the same thing here for the student table, where we will add a whole number column and name it student number ID, and we'll match that to the key inside of the key column, making sure that it's related to that whole number. We have one extra step inside of this student table. Because we have a lookup to lesson, and lookup is a GUID, we won't be able to make the mapping match inside of Azure Data Factory when we're in there. So we're going to do something similar than the student number ID, where we give it a whole number, but this time we're going to make it equal to this lesson lookup. So inside of the student table, we'll add a column. We'll name it lesson number ID. And we'll make this equal to whole number. And we'll select done. Save the table. Now we'll navigate back to the Azure portal, and you can search Data Factory in the search bar at the top and select Data Factories. We're going to use Azure Data Factory to copy over the data from the SQL database into Dataverse. And we'll also make the relationship mapping inside of this Azure Data Factory. So you'll click on New, and you'll make sure that your subscription resource groups are all connected. I give it a name, go to Git configuration. I'm going to skip this for now. Leave these as is. And click Create. Author and monitor. And now we have to make the connection for both the Azure SQL database instance and the Power Apps environment instance. So we'll click this Manage at the bottom and click this Create a Link Service. Start typing Azure SQL. Continue. Give it a name. Fill out all of the information, including your username and password, and click Create. Once your Azure Link Service is connected successfully, you'll want to do the same thing for Dataverse. Start typing Common Data Service. Same idea here. Once you have tested the connection for both of these link services, we're going to go into Author, and we're going to click the ellipses next to Datasets. We're going to click New Dataset. And we're going to make the connection into the tables now. So we'll click on Azure Data SQL. We'll give this a name. We'll connect lesson first. And now we are able to see DBO lesson for this. So we'll click lesson. Click OK. We can preview the data here. So this is what we see from the SQL server here. So everything is good to go there. We can test the connection just to make sure. And we'll do the same thing for Dataverse. So we'll click on the ellipses, New Dataset, Common Data Service, continue. And we'll select the link service that we connected to, and the entity name will be the same. So if you start typing lesson, you'll be able to see it there. You can test the connection. And preview the data as well. We don't have any data inside of Dataverse right now, so we actually won't see any data. But we'll repeat the same steps for student. So now that we have a data set for student that looks a little bit like this, and an Azure SQL data set for student as well, something like this. We're going to create one more data set. This is going to be a lookup data set. It's going to be connected to Dataverse. And we're actually not going to connect this to any table. We're going to use this for when we go and map the lookups to the whole numbers. So we'll just connect it to the CDS instance, but we won't connect it to the data set or to an entity name. Okay, so now we have our data sets ready, and we'll go ahead and publish at this step. So select publish all. Once you get the notification that it's complete, we'll go up to pipelines and we'll click on the ellipsis and new pipeline. We'll click this drop down for move and transform, and we can drag and drop this copy data. We'll give this pipeline a name. This one is going to be for lesson. So we're going to copy lesson from the SQL database into Dataverse. Give both of them the same name. Going to try to adjust this so that you can see the screen better. So now that we have that name set up, we're going to click on source, and this is where we're going to choose where it's going to come from. So the source is going to come from Azure SQL, and this is going to be for lesson. So we're going to select that. We'll leave everything as is, and the sink is going to be where it's going to go to. So for us, it's going to go to Dataverse. So we'll select CDS lesson. That's that data set. Both of these are the data sets that we set up here on the left-hand side. And here in the alternate key name, we're going to select that key that we created in Dataverse when we first started this process. And we're going to leave mapping as is. We'll publish all. So one more step before we actually trigger this pipeline, we're going to want to import the schemas, and this is where we're going to do the mapping between Azure SQL and Dataverse. So import schemas, and what I like to do is I just select all, delete, and click new mapping to start from the beginning. So lesson ID is going to be mapped. Oh, let's start with lesson name. We're going to map that to the destination lesson name. Lesson type is going to be matched to lesson type. Start date. End date. Or you can search for it. And then the last one, lesson ID, because this is an integer, we're going to map that to the whole number that we created inside of here. So remember, we created that whole number that we then added a key for. So it's going to be lesson number ID. Go back to here and start typing lesson number ID. So as you can see, integer and integer. If we clicked on lesson ID, this type would have shown up as a GUID, and we wouldn't have been able to complete this publish. So once that's done, publish this. And then we're going to click on this add trigger button here. Trigger now, click OK. And then to monitor the results, we're going to click on this third navigation button down. And the pipeline succeeded. So now we can go back to our Power App and modify the view so that we can see everything. But if we click refresh here, we should be able to see that data from the Azure SQL database that we see here. So we should be able to see these 3 rows right here inside of our data. And there they are. And like I said, we can modify the forms and the views to make sure that we see all of the columns that we see there. But as you can see, the data has transferred over successfully and seamlessly. So that you can see the full data transfer, I've gone ahead and added the rest of the columns here. So you can see that the start date, end date, lesson type, lesson name, and the lesson number have all transferred over. So now we're going to do something similar for student. There's going to be one additional step for student since we're going to be creating that relationship to the lookup for lesson. So we'll create a new pipeline. Give it a name. Do the same copy data. The same step for source. The source will be Azure SQL Student. We'll leave this as is. The sink where it's going to go is going to be CDS Student. We'll connect that key that we created in Dataverse. And now for mapping, we're going to do the same thing that we did for lesson, but we're going to map the integer for lesson in here. So as you can see, it has already auto mapped some of them, so but they're incorrect. So we'll go ahead and delete them all and start from here. So student ID is going to be that integer, not actually student ID. So it's going to be the student number that we created. First name, same thing, last name, city, email, once we get to the bottom of the page here, it's kind of hard to scroll. As you can see. So for lesson ID, since it's coming from a SQL database that is integer and not GUID, we're going to use that lesson number ID that we created inside of the student table. So I'll just start typing lesson to make it easier. And it's going to be lesson number ID. That way it matches the data type. So once we have that, we can go ahead and publish to make sure that everything is saved. And now you're probably wondering how we're going to map and make sure that the lookup gets added and mapped correctly to this integer. Because if we copy it over right now, it's just going to be added as a number and it's not actually going to be added and mapped to the lesson. So it's not going to say, what was it, Power Apps or Azure or SQL as a lesson. It's just going to say the number that it's related to. So we're going to add a new copy data next to this. We're going to take this green and we're going to create that relationship to the new one. And we'll give this a different name. So we'll say relationship student. And the source will be the lookup query that we created. So none of these except for the CDS lookup. And instead of table, we're actually going to select query. And there is a template here that I'm going to be using that I'll add to the description of this video. So you can just copy and paste it into your instance. So the template is going to look something like this. The more tables that you have to link, the more of these link entity attributes you're going to add, and the more attributes you're going to add as well. So in here, we're going to add the entity name for student. So we'll go back to Power Apps, and the entity name is the schema name. So for me, it's APS_student. And the attribute name is going to be the ID, but this ID is going to be that integer ID, not the GUID ID. So we'll go into student. We'll select custom. And like I said, it's going to be the student ID, but the whole number, not the unique identifier. So I'll take this, copy it into that first attribute name, and the second attribute is going to be added in a second, but we're actually going to focus on this linked entity. So this linked entity is going to come from the entity that is linking to, so lesson. So the schema name for lesson, which should be just APS_lesson. Yep. And from is going to be the whole number column that we added that's coming from lesson. So inside lesson, what did we name that whole number that's going to be acting as our unique identifier? So it's going to be APS lesson number ID. And that's going to be mapped to the whole number that we created inside student for lesson. And I think it's something similar. Yeah. So it's actually the same thing. But this is what's going to be connected to the lookup that's right below that. Yours might be a little bit different. And we want to give this an alias, so we'll just use the letter L for lesson. And the attribute name is going to be that unique identifier for lesson inside of student. So for me, it's this. That's that lookup value. And I'll just use the same thing for the alias. And then up here, we have one more to add. So we're going to take that 2, what we have inside of 2, and add it to the attribute name. Now we'll add sync. So we're going to sync this into CDS student. And we want to make sure that we add the alternate key in here. We'll go back to source, see if we can preview the data. And it looks like we did get an error. It says that it's expecting an equal sign, and I did not add that here. So maybe now it will work. So as you can see, this isn't just cut and dry. There is some troubleshooting that you're probably going to have to do on your end to try to get this to work. So for me, it's saying that APS lesson entity doesn't contain the attribute name APS lesson. So that was probably my bad. We want to go into lesson and get the unique identifier from there instead of trying to get it from student. So this is it. So it's APS lesson ID. We'll copy that, paste that in there. Now we'll preview data. And there's no data to preview, but there is no error. So I went back, double checked my work, realized that the lookup that I created inside of student wasn't actually doing a lookup to lesson, it was doing a lookup to student. So I went back, recreated this lookup to lesson, made sure that the name schema was lesson ID so that it matched the lesson ID from the lesson table. I published my customizations. I came back here, double checked my work, make sure that everything is good to go. If I hit preview data, I should be seeing, I should be seeing the mapping going on here. So student number ID, that's the ID coming from the SQL Server database. So for reference, here is the SQL Server database. And as you can see here, the student number is right there, 1 through 6. And then the lesson number ID is 1 through 3, right? From this SQL database here, 1 through 3, and we only see numbers 1 through 3 here. And then with that query that we've added, we've created a GUID that belongs to each of these integers. So if your SQL database already has GUIDs, you can actually skip this step. You don't have to be doing all of this mapping to integers like I'm doing here, but sometimes it does require it because some SQL databases don't have GUIDs integrated. So we have to kind of force it into Dataverse because Dataverse does require GUIDs for lookups and unique identifiers. So now that we have both of our GUIDs connected and mapped to the respective integers, we can go ahead and run this and then go back to Power Apps. And if this run is successful, we'll be able to see that lookup mapped inside of Power Apps. All right, so our pipeline has succeeded and it looks like it is good to go. As you can see here, succeeded the second time around. So we'll go back to Power Apps and see what our data looks like. I've already gone ahead and changed the views, and voila, here is the lookup, and it is mapped correctly. Double checking our work. 1 means Power Apps, 2 means Azure, 3 means SQL, and making sure that our 1 through 3 are up here. As you can see here, this mapped correctly and it is ready to be used however you would like. You can get rid of this lesson number if you don't need to migrate any data moving forward. But this is how you create that relationship between two tables using Azure Data Factory from a SQL server that only has integers. As you can see here, it does take a little bit of time, a little bit of troubleshooting, but it can be done. I'm so glad you found this video. I had been searching the internet for ways to migrate data from Azure SQL, an old Azure SQL instance, to Dataverse. I needed to find how to migrate those GUIDs where the SQL database didn't have any. This was the solution that I found. I know it's a little bit hacky, but it works. It gets those lookups in there, and as you can see, we are able to make those mapping connections inside of Dataverse and get started. Thanks for joining me today. Please follow me on LinkedIn and Twitter so we can stay connected and you will get to see when I post my next video. Have a great one.